Today's talk is with Mark. Today's talk was with Mark Lantz from IBM Research Lab, who is going to speak to us today on the future of digital archive storage technology. Without any further ado, please, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, Mark. Please go ahead.
All right, perfect. Let me just quickly share the slides. Can you see the presentation okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to come and talk to you guys today. The talk, I basically want to try to give you kind of a research perspective on the future of archival storage technology. And when I say research perspective, what I mean is I'm not really going to talk about specific future IBM products or anything like that, maybe give a couple of examples, but I want to look a little bit more generally about how we think magnetic tape technology will be able to scale in the coming decade and how some of the competing technologies like HDD will scale, and also take a look at some emerging experimental archival storage technologies. Start out with a very brief outline of the talk. The first part of the talk will kind of focus a little bit on magnetic recording and tape. As a kind of introduction, I wanted to talk a little bit about the current environment of tape storage and the kind of renaissance that magnetic tape industry has been experiencing in the last few years. I'll then talk a little bit more generally about some of the challenges in scaling magnetic recording technology and why those challenges currently affect HDD and tape technology differently. Then come back and focus a little bit more on tape, tell you a little bit about some recent research demonstrations we've done on the future scaling potential of tape and how they help to kind of validate some of the projections of the latest information storage industry consortium tape roadmap. Then in the second part of the talk, we'll come back and look a little bit more closely at hard disk drives, some of the recent trends in scaling capacity of HDD, and then we'll talk a little bit about heat-assisted magnetic recording, or HAMR. And then finally, in the last part of the presentation, we'll look at some of these emerging archival storage technologies like DNA storage and some of the different optical storage technologies that are currently being developed. And then I'll wrap up with a very quick summary. So magnetic tape is, as a digital data storage technology, is almost 75 years old. But despite that long history, this is actually a really exciting time to be working on the technology. And that's really because of the convergence of these two trends. First, data continues to grow exponentially. That's driven by a lot of different trends and technologies, AI probably being the most recent one. But that exponential growth in data has been combined with a really dramatic slowdown or stagnation in the areal density scaling of hard disk drives. And that areal density scaling is really critical because historically, that's what's driven the cost scaling, or the dollars per terabyte scaling of HDD. So a slowdown in areal density has really translated into a slowdown in the cost scaling. And so for many of our customers at IBM, their data centers are starting to get out of balance in that they're creating data at a much faster rate than they can afford to store it, at least if they wanted to store all of that data on spinning disk. Now, fortunately, a very large fraction of the data out there's estimates are somewhere between 60 to 70% of all data is what we call cold data. It's very infrequently accessed, or sometimes it's never accessed, but there's still a motivation to preserve that data, sometimes for legal compliance reasons, or sometimes because as the technology evolves, there may be opportunities to use or for companies to monetize that data in the future. And so there's a motivation for many enterprises to keep as much data as they can, but it's becoming more and more expensive. I have to admit, I've been working on magnetic tape technology for close to 2 decades now. And so I may be a little bit biased in my enthusiasm for the technology. And so I think it's interesting to ask the question, what do some of the big hyperscale cloud companies think about tape technology? If you go back to 2006, companies like Microsoft were making statements like tape is dead, disk is the new tape, flash is the new disk, yada, yada, yada. But you fast forward a decade, and since 2015, Microsoft has been making statements like all cloud vendors will be using tape and using it at a level never seen before. So what's changed? Why is tape so exciting again, especially for hyperscale cloud companies? I think there's really four reasons. First of all, of course, cost is very important. Even at the hyperscale, where companies like Microsoft quite literally buy hard disk drives by the truckload, they design their own customized, very efficient storage systems. But even at their scale, it's about 4 times less expensive to store data from a total cost of ownership point of view on tape than on hard disk drives. Now, part of that cost savings comes because tape has a very low power consumption. Once data has been written to a cartridge, that cartridge just sits in a slot in a library and doesn't consume any power. And that contributes to another advantage, which is the kind of sustainability or the very low CO2e footprint of tape compared to other technologies. How much lower it is really depends on the specifics of the comparison you make. So just to give you one concrete example, if we take our latest Diamondback tape library, that's kind of a single rack tape library with LTO9 technology, you have 27 petabytes of storage capacity. If I compare that to an open compute hard disk solution with 27 petabytes of capacity, then the tape solution has 96% less CO2 emissions over a 10-year lifetime. And that includes everything from manufacturing to operation and disposal at the end of life of the technology. So much, much lower CO2e footprint. Another important area, of course, is security. Tape has a natural physical built-in air gap. If a cartridge isn't mounted in a drive, the data can't be read or modified. Tape was the first data storage technology with built-in on-the-fly encryption, and we are continuing to try to innovate in this space. In fact, here in the IBM Zurich lab, the security department developed 3 of the 4 quantum safe encryption algorithms that have recently been standardized by NIST. And our latest LTO10 tape drive actually comes quantum safe ready, so that it has all of the technology in it to use those new quantum safe encryption algorithms as soon as the applications support it. But of kind of all of the advantages of tape technology, the most important one, I think, especially for hyperscale cloud companies, is the future scaling potential of tape technology. I mentioned that HDD areal density scaling has really slowed down dramatically in the last few years. In contrast to that, tape has huge potential to continue scaling at its historical rates in the coming future, which raises kind of an interesting question, right? Both of these technologies use the same basic magnetic recording principles. Tape is actually a few years older than HDD technology, so it's kind of surprising that HDD has slowed down, whereas tape has room to keep scaling. To understand why that is, it's helpful to look at how those two technologies have been scaled in their recent history. This chart shows on top the areal density of hard disk drives over the last couple of decades, the HDD products shown with the red squares, and in comparison, the areal density of tape drives is shown by the green squares at the bottom. Now, HDD industry is much larger than the tape industry. At its peak, it had revenues of more than $40 billion a year. That large revenue enabled very large R&D budgets, which in turn enabled very aggressive scaling of the technology. In fact, in the late 90s, the areal density of hard disk drives was scaling with more than 100% compound annual growth rate. So the capacity of disk drives was more than doubling every year. Unfortunately, there are some fundamental physical limits as to how far we can shrink the size of the bits that we write on that magnetic medium. The first really major challenge that you kind of bump up against is caused by something called the superparamagnetic limit. I'll come back on the next slide and talk a little bit more about that. But the HDD industry has basically reached the point where they're really struggling with this superparamagnetic limit. And because of that, the areal density scaling of HDD technology has been very slow for almost the last decade. In comparison to that, tape technology has been scaled at a more modest and continuous rate over the last couple of decades, so that today the highest capacity tape system on the market operates at an areal density that's about 50 times lower. So the bits written on tape are about 50 times larger than the bits written on HDD. Because of that gap, we're much, much further away from this superparamagnetic limit. And so we have the potential to keep scaling the technology for at least the next couple of decades before we reach the same areal densities where HDD is today, at which point tape will also start to struggle with this superparamagnetic limit. So what is this superparamagnetic effect? It basically comes about because of the way information is stored in magnetic recording, where we're basically setting the magnetic state of small regions of a thin magnetic film that's either coded on a disk or on a tape. The image you see at the top is an example of a track written on an HDD in perpendicular recording. So red indicates magnetization pointing out of the screen. Purple is magnetization into the screen. And the information is actually encoded in the transition from one magnetic state to the other, or in the absence of a transition. Now, in an ideal world, those transitions would be perfectly straight lines, but because the magnetic medium is made up of these small grains or small particles, there's a lot of roughness associated with the edge of the transition. And this gives rise to noise when we try to read back the information, what we call media noise. And so if we want to shrink the size of the bits that we're writing on the disk or the tape to get a higher capacity, we have to shrink the size of those magnetic grains so that that transition remains relatively straight, or we have a kind of constant signal to noise ratio as we shrink the size of the bits that we're writing. And this is exactly what the magnetic recording industry has been doing for the last 70 years, shrinking the size of the grains so that we can scale the size of the bits that we write. The challenge is that when we shrink the size of those magnetic grains, they become less thermally stable as a function of time, so that the information that we store there could potentially be lost. So to compensate for that, we have been tuning the media to increase its coercivity. So there's basically more magnetization energy, or the information that we write is more stable as a function of time, even though the bits and the grains are smaller. The challenge is when we increase the coercivity, we need a much stronger magnetic field to set the magnetic state. And the HDD industry has actually reached the point where if they increase the coercivity of the media anymore, they can't produce enough magnetic field to set the magnetic state in the first place. So the information would be stable, they just can't write any information in such high coercivity media. That doesn't mean we've reached the end of scaling of HDD technology. The industry has been working on what are called energy-assisted magnetic recording for more than a decade. The most promising of that family of techniques is something called HAMR, or heat-assisted magnetic recording, which is now actually shipping in large volumes. And I'll talk more about that in the second part of the presentation. If we compare HDD to tape, tape is operating at this much lower areal density, so we're still very far away from this superparamagnetic limit. We have lots of room to keep scaling the technology, even though the technology has been quite effectively scaled over its long history. I can quantify that a little bit. IBM's first tape product came out in the early 50s with a capacity of around 2 megabytes per reel, operating at an areal density of around 1,000 bits per square inch. Our most recent enterprise product, the TS1170, came out in 2023 with a native cartridge capacity of 50 terabytes and operating at an areal density of just over 26 gigabits per square inch. So that's more than 18 million times increase in the areal density, or shrinking the size of the magnetic bits by a factor of more than 18 million times. So the technology has been quite effectively scaled, but there's still a lot of potential to keep scaling the technology. That's really one of the main focuses of my research team here in Zurich, is developing the technologies to enable that continued scaling and exploring kind of how much room there is to continue scaling. One of the ways that we do that is through what we call areal density demonstrations, where we collaborate with our media supply companies to develop and test new media technologies that we combine with the new hardware technologies that we've developed to see how far we could potentially push tape technology in the future. And in our most recent demonstration that we did in collaboration with Fujifilm, we could show single channel recording at 317 gigabits per square inch, which could enable a potential cartridge capacity of 580 terabytes. So huge potential really to keep scaling tape technology. Now there's a lot of hardware technologies behind this demonstration, but I don't want to bore you with all of the technical details of that, so I'll kind of skip over that side of things. So what does this mean for the future scaling potential of tape? Well, the Information Storage Industry Consortium, INSIC, every couple of years publishes a roadmap on the future scaling of tape technology. It's not intended as a product roadmap, but it's really the perspective of experts from the industry on how we think tape technology will be able to scale in the coming decade. And the most recent roadmap basically projects that the areal density of tape will likely scale with around a 28% compound annual growth rate, basically similar to the recent trends of products. If you look at our most recent areal density demonstration of 317 gigabits per square inch, which is shown by one of the diamonds on the center of the figure, if we extrapolate that onto the roadmap, it actually intersects the roadmap a little bit beyond the end of the last data point there. So already today in the lab, we've demonstrated the main technologies that we need in order to enable the continued scaling of tape technology for about the next decade. So really lots of potential to keep scaling tape. INSIC publishes a lot more details on how the tape technology is expected to scale. This is a table from the roadmap. I don't want to go through all of it. It's a bit of an eye chart, but just wanted to highlight a couple of things. So areal density is projected to scale with this roughly 28% compound annual growth rate. That areal density scaling combined with some minor improvements in the format and modest increases in the tape length by making the tape a little bit thinner. We expect the capacity of tapes to scale with about a 32% compound annual growth rate, which corresponds to doubling in capacity roughly every 2.5 years. And over the same period, we expect the data rate of tape systems to scale with about a 15% compound annual growth rate. So by the time we get out to the end of the roadmap in the 2034 timeframe, we expect to have tape drives that have native cartridge capacities of hundreds of terabytes and that operate at data rates of 1.6 gigabytes per second. So really lots of potential to keep scaling the technology. Beyond just research and development on the continued scaling of tape, recently there's also been a lot of effort on trying to make tape technology easier to use. I just want to give you kind of one example of that my team in Zurich contributed to. It's a relatively recent product called the S3 Deep Archive. This is a tape library that's built on our Diamondback library, which is kind of a single rack library that you can order preloaded with media and tape drives so that you just wheel it into the data center, plug it into network and power, and you're ready to go. The Deep Archive actually adds a small rack on top of the library that hosts a couple of servers with an SSD cache and a network switch. On those servers, we run a software stack that manages the tape library and presents a kind of S3 Glacier interface so that any application that had previously been pushing data out to a Glacier cloud service can now send data directly to this on-premise solution, but at a much, much lower cost. And the whole system has been designed for kind of minimizing the need for any specialized tape skills to deploy or manage the solution. So lots of work on enabling the continued scaling of tape, but also work at IBM and many other companies and trying to make tape much easier to use, to deploy, and to manage. Um, so what about HDD technology? I mentioned in the beginning the areal density scaling of HDD has really stagnated in the last several years, and that's translated into this slowdown in the average cost in terms of dollars per terabyte of HDD technology. But if you compare these two figures, you probably notice that the areal density scaling has been almost flat for the last 10 years, whereas at least initially, the cost scaling of HDD continued to fall for quite some years. It's only in the last few years that it's been really flat. And so there's something else that's been going on. And this is what I refer to as volumetric scaling. So the HDD industry has essentially been compensating for the slowdown in areal density scaling by adding more disks and heads to an HDD to enable increases in capacity. Um, Initially, that was a very efficient strategy. Back in the early 2000 timeframe, a high capacity disk had just a single platter and two heads, the marginal manufacturing cost of around $50. You could add one more disk and two more heads, each of which cost, $1 or $2. So you increase the manufacturing costs by maybe $5 or $6 or 10%, 12%, but you've doubled the capacity. That's a really good deal. But if you want to do it a second time, now you have to add two disks and four heads. So you increase the cost by maybe 20, 25%. But again, you've doubled the capacity. But you can see the returns are diminishing each time we try to do this. And of course, there are additional challenges like you start to run out of space in the HDD enclosure. And this was actually one of the main motivations of the HDD industry to go to helium technology, is that helium is a much smaller molecule than ambient air. It creates much less turbulence in the HDD enclosure, so you can use much thinner disks and squeeze more platters into the same form factor. In fact, the latest high capacity kind of 26 terabyte disks actually have 11 platters squeezed into that narrow form factor. And Toshiba recently announced they've developed a new technology that will enable them to get up to 12 platters in that. But the scaling has really slowed down dramatically. It's getting harder and harder to squeeze more platters into that form factor. Of course, we don't have to stick to that form factor. You could make a 2-inch high disk and put 22 platters in there today and double the capacity. However, that won't happen because we've already reached the point where the cost of the disks and the heads really dominate the cost of manufacturing the disk. So if you doubled the number of platters, you'd almost double the cost of the disk. So instead of buying one high capacity 2-inch disk, you may as well buy two 1-inch disks and get double the capacity and double the IOPS performance. And because of this difficulty of squeezing more platters in and the fact that the cost of the platters now dominates the cost of the disks, we've seen the cost scaling of HDD also really stagnate in the last couple of years. That doesn't mean we're at the end of scaling. As I mentioned, the industry has been working on these energy-assisted technologies, the most promising of which is this HAMR heat-assisted magnetic recording, where the basic idea is that we integrate a laser onto the HDD head that we focus down to a nanoscale spot size using something called a near-field transducer that enables us to very locally heat the media as it passes under the head. We do that because the coercivity of the media decreases as a function of temperature. So if we heat it up, we temporarily lower the coercivity so that we can write data. Then as the disk spins under the head, the media cools off. We essentially freeze the data into the surface of the head. That's an idea that's been around for a long time. The HDD industry has been actually working on it for a very long time, but there have been a lot of engineering challenges in making that technology reliable enough to kind of ship at scale. The biggest challenge is related to the reliability and lifetime of the lasers. Unfortunately, this process of focusing kind of visible light down to a nanoscale spot size is extremely inefficient. Only a couple percent of the laser power actually goes into heating up the media, and a large fraction of that residual power goes into heating the laser and the near field transducer. And because we have to integrate those components onto the tiny little HDD head, and we have to squeeze 20 of them into the HDD case, there's no room for heat sinking. And so the lasers tend to get hot and they have a fairly short lifetime. Um, there's been a lot of progress in increasing the lifetime of the lasers. And in fact, Seagate announced earlier this year that they have now achieved the same reliability in their HAMR platform as in their conventional magnetic recording platform, which really leaves just the last major challenge of HAMR technology, which is cost. You remember these high capacity disks today have up to 22 heads integrated with them, which means we have to add 22 lasers and near field transducers to that disk, which adds significant cost. Um, and so we need a significant increase in the capacity just to maintain the same dollars per terabyte of HAMR technology. I find it kind of useful to ask the question about when this technology might come on the market. Uh, for the last decade, HAMR technology was kind of 1 or 2 years away from commercialization, but today it is actually available, at least from Seagate. They had been sampling HAMR drives to their large hyperscale cloud customers for many years. In 2023, they started sampling their 30 terabyte HAMR platform, and in the middle of last year, they actually started shipping those 30 terabyte HAMR drives in volume. Somewhat interestingly or surprising to me, at the same time they announced they were ramping to high volumes for their 30 terabyte platform, they also announced a new 22 terabyte conventional HDD and a 24 terabyte shingled HDD, which is kind of curious. Why would you want to buy a 24 terabyte shingled drive if you can buy a 30 terabyte HAMR drive? And the reason, of course, is cost because of the added cost of the lasers from a dollars per terabyte point of view. The HAMR drive is not less expensive than the SMR drives. However, Seagate also recently announced that those are their last conventional HDD drives, and that from now on they will focus on HAMR technology. And they started sampling a 36 terabyte shingled HAMR drive at the beginning of this year, and said they're planning to ramp that to higher volumes in the beginning of next year. Uh, the Seagate also announced a kind of roadmap where they said they expect to continue scaling their HAMR platform, and they think they can get to a 50 terabyte disk by the 2028 timeframe, which corresponds roughly to a 13.5% compound annual growth rate in the capacity. Um, Other HDD companies like Western Digital in the past had made statements like they don't think HDD HAMR technology will ever be competitive. But more recently, they announced that they are also working on HAMR technology, and they expect to start sampling a 36 terabyte conventional HAMR drive and a 44 terabyte shingled HAMR drive in the 2026 timeframe, and that they will ramp to high volumes in the 2027 timeframe. And Toshiba also recently demoed their own 32 terabyte HAMR drive that they said they expect to start sampling in 2025 and ramping to higher volumes in the future. Um, so this introduction of HAMR technology has enabled an increase in the scaling of the areal density of HDD. Seagate has not published the areal density where those drives operate at, but you can kind of estimate it based on the capacity of the disk and the size of the platters inside of it. So these two orange dots that I've added to this areal density scaling plot are estimates of the areal density of the recent HAMR drives. So we have seen a kind of uptick in the scaling of areal density. But even though these disks started shipping in 2024, they have not yet impacted the cost scaling of HDD because of this added cost of the lasers. And the estimates I've heard is they need to get to about a 40 terabyte disk before they cover the additional cost of the lasers. Kind of beyond 40 terabytes, we expect to see again an increase in this cost scaling of HDD based on HAMR technology. So what does the kind of future look like? Um, Roughly 10 years ago, HDD and tape technology were scaling their capacity at similar rates. HDD, shown by the red symbols, was scaling primarily through this volumetric scaling, whereas tape systems, shown as the black circles, scaled primarily through areal density scaling. This volumetric scaling has basically run out of scaling potential, and so we've started to see a divergence between the scaling rate of the capacity of HDD and tape systems. HAMR technology has started to ship at volume. This red solid line at the end of the plot shows this projection of Seagate that they can achieve a 50 terabyte disk by 2028, roughly this 13.5% CAGR. The black solid line is the projection of the INSIC roadmap of a 32% CAGR in the capacity of tape systems. So both technologies have the potential to continue scaling for the next several years, but we expect that tape technology will scale faster and has the potential to scale quite a bit longer than HDD technology. And so we expect the cost advantages of tape over HDD will kind of grow in the foreseeable future. Of course, both of these technologies will eventually reach some kind of fundamental physical limit into how far we can shrink the size of the bits that we write on the magnetic medium. And so part of my research interests is asking the question of what other technologies are out there that could enable us to continue scaling archival data storage technologies beyond the scaling potential of magnetic technologies. Um, I think the most promising technology from a kind of purely volumetric storage potential is DNA storage technology, where the basic idea is that we use DNA synthesis technology to encode digital data using the base pairs of a DNA molecule. We have 4 different nucleotides, which would enable us to encode roughly 2 bits per base pair, which is an enormous volumetric storage density. Um, and we can use DNA sequencing technology to read back that information. Um, there are a few advantages or potential advantages of DNA storage technology. As I said, it has a very high volumetric storage density, basically hundreds of petabytes per gram of DNA. In fact, you could probably put all of the world's data in a shoebox if you could encode it in DNA storage technology. What's actually been demonstrated today is only writing a few gigabytes of data. DNA also has a long lifetime, at least if you store it in a controlled oxygen-free environment. And because DNA is important to us as a species, the technology to read back DNA is likely to be around for a long time, which is a useful characteristic for an archival storage technology. The drawbacks of the technology are that, at least today, it's extremely expensive. It costs around $1,000 per gigabyte to read data written in DNA. And it's actually much more expensive to write the data in the first place. Once you've written data, it's very inexpensive to make copies, but the original or the first time that you write the data is very expensive. The cost of reading DNA has been falling very fast in recent years, primarily because DNA sequencing technology is very important in the healthcare industry, and the healthcare industry is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Uh, the technology for synthesizing or writing DNA is really only used in research. That's a much, much smaller market. And because of that, the cost of synthesizing DNA has been falling at a much slower rate, only about 13, 14% a year, which is a much slower scaling rate than tape technology today. Um, and so, in order to kind of close the gap between the cost of writing and reading data in DNA, we need really dramatic acceleration in the progress of these technologies. Um, the data rate of reading DNA data is also very slow, up to a few megabytes per second if you throw enough parallelism at the problem, but it's still very expensive. There are also some challenges around doing kind of random file access. There's very interesting research in how to address that problem, but all of the solutions kind of give you a trade-off that the more random access you have to the files, the lower the volumetric storage density you have. But in spite of those trade-offs, you still have an extremely high volumetric storage density for DNA technology. There's a lot of money going into research in this area. There's quite some interesting startups, but there's also a lot of churn in the industry. One of the most promising technologies from my perspective was being developed by a company called Catalog that unfortunately went out of business about a month ago. The Coming back to my favorite question of when will this technology be available on the market? Well, it turns out it's actually available today. There's a company in France called Biomemory that has a product they call the DNA drive, which when I first heard about this, I was very excited and impressed. Whenever you put the word drive at the end of your technology, it sounds like a kind of plug and play storage technology. The reality is a little different. What they're actually offering is a kind of wallet-sized card uh, that you can store 1 kilobyte of text data that they have encoded in DNA for you. For the low, low price of €1,000, they will ship you two identical cards with your 1 kilobyte of data, and they include one free read in that price, but that unfortunately destroys one of the cards. So technology is commercially available. It's extremely expensive at the moment, but I think this is kind of representative of how the technology might eventually be commercialized, where it would be targeting a kind of niche data storage space where someone wants to preserve relatively small amounts of data for very long periods of time, and where the cost of writing that data is not a major concern. Um, for the DNA to be cost competitive kind of at the data center level, I think is still probably several decades away. Um, so what other technologies are out there? There's actually quite a lot of work on various optical storage technologies. One of the most well-known that's gotten a lot of press in the recent years was initially branded as 5D optical storage, or what Microsoft has been calling glass storage technology, where the idea is you use something called a femtosecond laser to create a voxel, which is essentially a nanograding in a quartz plate. Um, that voxel can be used to encode data in both the polarity and the intensity of reflected light. So you can store multiple bits of information in each voxel, actually today up to about 8 bits per voxel. And you can write those voxels through the volume of the glass plate. So you get three volumetric uh, dimensions and two additional dimensions from the polarity and intensity, hence this notion of 5D optical storage. The basic physical phenomenon was kind of discovered in the late 90s. The first demonstration as a data storage technology, I believe, was in 2013. Since that time, there's been quite a bit of progress in the volumetric storage density that could be achieved. The most recent demonstration was from Microsoft, where they could show storage of around 6 terabytes of user data. So after the overhead of error correction codes in a quartz plate that's 12 by 12 centimeters, about 3 millimeters thick. So from a volumetric point of view, that's a volumetric storage density somewhere in between LTO-9 and LTO-10 tape technology. So much, much higher than other optical technologies and somewhat comparable to tape technology, kind of at the level of an individual glass plate. But that I think is not really a very fair comparison because the tape is housed in a tape cartridge. So if you make a comparison more at the rack level or the library level, then at least Microsoft's design of a tape library has about 5 times lower capacity in terms of petabytes per square meter than the kind of state-of-the-art tape technology. So much, much better than optical technology. There's room to keep scaling the areal density and the volumetric density of the technology, but still a little bit lower than tape technology. The advantages of this technology is that quartz or glass is a relatively low-cost material, and data stored in glass can last for hundreds or even thousands of years. So it has a very long data lifetime. Drawbacks are today is a very low write speed. The highest kind of reported data rates in the literature are a few hundred kilobytes per second. And in order to write the data, you need this femtosecond laser, which costs on the order of $100,000 and consumes 800 watts of power, but only gives you a few hundred kilobytes of data rate. So technology is kind of quite far away from being competitive with magnetic recording technology. It has some um, future volumetric scaling potential, but really needs a lot of advancements to be cost competitive. When will it potentially be available on the market? Well, again, it turns out you can actually use this technology today. There's a company called S Photonics, which was a spin-off from the University of Southampton that first invented or first demonstrated the technology as a data storage technology that is offering a kind of data storage as a service where you can send them your data and they will write it in a quartz disk and either keep that disk for you in a safe place or they'll ship the disk back to you. The cost today is $6 per megabyte with a minimum order of 500 megabytes, which is roughly 1 million times more expensive than storing data on something like LTO-8 tape. Uh, so really need a lot of progress in the cost of the technology um, before it can be cost competitive. Um, there are also many other optical startups working on archival storage technology. I picked a few just to give you a couple more examples. Cerabyte is a company that was started in Germany that also uses femtosecond lasers to store data in a thin ceramic film on glass sheets. They combine the femtosecond laser with a digital mirror technology similar to the technology in a beamer so that they can write many bits in parallel. That gives them a much higher data rate than the glass technology. But because they only write on the surface, they have a much lower volumetric storage density. Today, they have something like 400 gigabytes of capacity in a cartridge that's the same size as an LTO tape cartridge. Um, Folio is a startup in the US that's developed a very low cost technology for manufacturing multi-layer optical disc technology using a kind of extrusion technology. Uh, Today, they uh, can basically offer a multi-layer Blu-ray technology because they have more layers than conventional Blu-ray, have a little bit higher capacity than conventional Blu-ray, and they have a roadmap to kind of scale the capacity for a couple of generations by doubling the number of layers with each generation. There's another company in the US called Wave Domain um, that uses a kind of photographic process to encode data in the color of pixels that they write on a glass plate. So they can again encode multiple bits per pixel that gives them a higher storage density than conventional optical recording, but they have kind of limited um, scaling potential. So today, all of these technologies operate at quite a bit lower areal and volumetric storage density than magnetic tape technology. And they all have, I would say, less future scaling potential than tape technology. So it's kind of curious, why would somebody invest in a startup like this? And what's a kind of common theme of all of these companies is they have a worm, a write once, read many storage technology, where they claim that the data is extremely stable. So if you write your data in this technology, you will never have to migrate, or you can keep your data in that technology for 100 years, which means that in the long run, you can save money because you never have to migrate your data, uh, which, at least on the surface, sounds like an attractive proposition, right? Migration is kind of a pain, and so if you could avoid that, um, maybe it would be worth paying a little bit more for the technology upfront if you could save money in the long term. And so I think it's interesting to, kind of explore that question a little bit more. Is it a realistic strategy to write digital data on a piece of media and not migrate it for 100 years? To answer that question, you really need to make projections about what will storage and computing technology look like in 100 years. And I personally have no idea. I have very difficult time even projecting what compute technology will look like in 10 years, let alone in 100 years. But maybe we can learn something by kind of turning the question around and asking, what was state-of-the-art digital data storage technology like 100 years ago? Well, that, of course, was the punch card, right? Came out in 1928. Gen 1 had a capacity of about 80 characters per card, or roughly 80 bytes. Some institutions used that technology for a long time. The National Archives Record Service in the US, for example, had a warehouse in 1959 with tens of millions of punch cards in it, on the order of a couple of gigabytes of data. By 2021, they had more than 100 terabytes of digital data. If they had still been keeping all of their data on punch cards, they would need something like 83,000 of these warehouses to store all of that data. Or you could put it all on just three JF tape cartridges. Um, so I don't know about you, but I think I would prefer a higher volumetric storage technology than keeping my data on the same technology for 100 years. Another kind of interesting uh, dimension of this thought experiment is, of all of the companies that made punch card technology in the 20s and 30s, how many of them are still in business? I know of at least one, right? IBM used to make punch cards, but we certainly don't make that technology anymore. And most of the other companies have since gone out of business. Uh, and but beyond just being able to read back the information from a piece of storage media that lasts for a long time, um, there are many other challenges in the preservation of digital data. I think the biggest challenge is that everything in the IT industry is constantly evolving and constantly changing, not just the basic storage technology, but everything. processor technology, the I/O technology, operating systems, software, data formats, everything is constantly changing. So even if you could write your data on a piece of media that's stable for 1,000 years or 100 years, and you could also preserve the hardware that you need to read back that information in 100 years, and you had a computer that you could plug that piece of hardware into and read back the bits of information, you still have a major challenge that it would be hard to interpret what those bits mean. If you're storing a simple ASCII text file or something like an archive PDF format, then in 100 years, you probably have a pretty good chance of understanding what those bits mean. But if you're storing something more complex, like, say, a 3D CAD file for the design of an airplane, I would guess that the chances of being able to interpret what those bits mean in 100 years will be close to zero. So any kind of digital data information preservation strategy has to include a strategy for migrating your data to formats that you will be able to interpret as technology evolves. And if you're going to migrate the format of your data, you may as well also format to a newer storage technology so that you can take advantage of gains in the volumetric storage density and the data rate of technologies. So a very quick summary. Sorry, I ran a little bit over time. At the moment, there are no new archival storage technologies that are expected to be commercially viable, or at least cost competitive with magnetic storage technology in the near future. HDD areal density growth has slowed down over the last several years, but with the introduction of hammer technology at scale, we've seen an increase in the scaling rate of areal density at around 13-14% CAGR, and that we expect in the not too distant future that will enable a continuation of the cost scaling of HDD, at least out to the kind of 50 terabyte disk range. But Seagate has also made announcements that they think they can get out to about 100 terabyte disk after the 50 terabyte. In comparison to that, tape has a sustainable roadmap for at least the next decade, where we expect the capacity of tape systems will be able to scale with about a 32% compound annual growth rate. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. We do have one question already in the chat. If people want to go ahead and put any of their additional questions into the chat or raise your hand. The first question we have is concerning encryption. The individual says, I would like to encrypt tapes for transportation, remove the encryption at the point of destination, and store them there unencrypted. How long does it take to decrypt a tape, say 10 terabytes uncompressed? Is it possible to, quote unquote, wait by the drive and then go home in the same day? Or does it, for instance, mean decrypting every single written bit and therefore, say, takes 3 days?
So you would have to read back the tape, the encrypted tape, and write the data. You could write the data to another tape at the same time, basically stream from one drive to the other. 10 terabytes of data at 400 megabytes per second you can do in a day. But our latest enterprise technology has a 50 terabyte capacity, and that takes about 28 hours to read back the entire tape. So it depends a little bit on the technology that you're using, but you have to read back the data from tape either into disk and then rewrite it to the same tape in an unencrypted format, or you could stream from the encrypted tape to another drive and write it in an unencrypted format in the other drive and then recycle the original cartridge.
Thank you. That helped a lot. We have
another question in the chat from can you comment on what is the long-term lifetime of current storage media? HDD, tape, optical disc. Thank you for this interesting talk.
So the archival lifetime of the technologies, um, the the bits written on magnetic media, like HDD and tape, are typically stable for 30 or even 50 years. HDDs themselves typically have a lifetime of about 5 years, usually because components like the motor fails. And so the useful lifetime of an HDD is on the order of about 5 years, after which you need to migrate the data or risk losing it. Tape technology, because it's a removable media technology, you don't have that failure mechanism. If the drive fails, you can just mount the cartridge in a different drive. The data written on tape is stable for 30 plus years. The big challenge we have is that the electronic components that we use to manufacture our tape drives tend to go end of life after maybe 5 to 10 years. And so we can't continue manufacturing and supporting a tape drive technology for more than about 10 years. Um, and so we recommend to most of our clients that they migrate their data every couple of generations. You don't need to migrate it every generation, but if you migrate every couple of generations, then you get some advantages of higher volumetric storage densities, higher data rates, and you guarantee that you will have drive technology available to read that data in the future. Uh, Compared to commercially available optical technologies, there's kind of a very wide spectrum out there. Um, Rewritable optical technology tends to have a relatively short lifetime. It's not a very reliable archival technology. The worm technologies, the write once technologies that are based on dyes have a longer lifetime, but there's quite a lot of variability between different brands. And there have been studies by, for example, by NIST that looked at the archival lifetime of different types of write once optical media that kind of vary, but they can be many tens of years. And then there, at least for a while, was a company called Millennia, which had a write once optical technology where they were essentially melting holes in a very thin metal film. And the stability of the data in that technology was hundreds of years. But again, the optical technology has the same problem that you need a drive that can read that technology. Optical has had quite a long history in the consumer space, and they have been able to maintain some backwards read compatibility. Um, but the use of optical technology um, in the consumer space is disappearing, right? The CDs and DVDs have been replaced by streaming services. Um, Distribution of content on CDs has disappeared. And so optical uh, players uh, are starting to get much more rare. And I would be a little bit hesitant about a long-term optical, uh, at least conventional optical strategy, because many of the big optical disc companies have actually stopped making optical players.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question here. Do you think tape storage is economically competitive against HDD storage for home usage? Say 2 to 20 terabyte.
No, I mean, the big advantage of tape technology comes because we can amortize the cost of a relatively expensive drive over many cartridges. So the typical use case, we have a ratio of maybe 50 to 100 cartridges for every tape drive, which means that tape is very efficient when you have a lot of data to store. Um, but if you only have a few tens of terabytes, it's not a good, what I would call on-prem solution. However, there are companies like Microsoft, for example, that offers a archival storage service that uses tape in their cloud and gives you a much lower storage cost than their HDD-based solutions. So using tape as a service, I think, could be a potential economic solution for small scale users or for home users, but I don't think tape will ever come back as kind of a consumer technology because it's not a good match for the amount of data that most people have to store.
We have no more questions in the chat. Anyone, any questions? No? Okay. So, Catherine, you want to close?
Sure. So thank you very much to all the participants, but especially thank you, Mark, for your presentation. It's extremely interesting, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. The talk today will be recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube as soon as possible. In case you missed it, or in case you have a colleague who you think could benefit from this, because I think this is something that a lot of us will take back to our colleagues as some very, very valuable information. So thank you. This is the last of the Library Science Talks for 2025. We hope to have another full schedule to offer for you for programs for next year. So tune in for further information. We will be available from the A-List website, but also from Centrale Bibliothèque Zurich. So you can find out more about what we'll be offering next year. Again, thank you, Mark, and thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.